Hello, welcome to another special edition of Roger Reviews. If you saw my previous video, I talked about how the environmental harm from plastic was generally less than the alternatives. And from that, you may have got the impression that I'm some sort of pro-plastic justice warrior, as I was recently called. And although that has a really nice ring to it, I don't think it's completely true, although you can decide for yourself by the end of this video. But I wanted to follow up on that video with how I think we can address the plastic waste problem without harming the environment. So I wanted to start by talking about the environmental crisis that we are facing as a species. So this is the Earth. It has a mass of 6 times 10 to the 24th kilograms. And if you look at plastic production and represent that as a sphere next to the sphere of the Earth, you can't see it because it's too small. In fact, you have to magnify it by about 1,000,000 times just to get a little sphere this size that's big enough that you can see a tiny dot next to the Earth. Now, 1,000,000 years is about 3 times as long as the human species has been on the Earth. So that's really a long time before we've made enough plastic that it looks like anything relative to the size of the Earth. Now, in contrast, let's look at what's around us. So this is it, and every time I look at this, it just scares me because it's so thin. This is drawn to scale, about 100 kilometers of atmosphere around the Earth. That's all we've got. Now, let's just in our minds suck all of that atmosphere off of the Earth and wad it into a ball, just for illustration purposes. And this is about the mass of that sphere that you would get if you took our whole atmosphere and put it together in a ball. And this is the mass of greenhouse gases that we put out per year. Okay, so this dot is already visible, and it's actually relatively substantial. It's enough that it's making a difference. And if you didn't believe that it was making a difference before, it's really hard to deny it now with all of the heating up of the Earth that we're seeing, with the increases in forest fires, in hurricanes, new temperature highs, both average and single day every year. I mean, the Earth is warming up, and it's because we are pushing out greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. So that's the crisis, and I do believe that we can do both at the same time, okay? So this is, you might say this is whataboutism. Just because we need to address one crisis doesn't mean we can't address the other. But I would hope that we can at least agree that if we want to do something about the plastic waste problem, we need to make sure we don't make the global climate change problem worse, okay? And that's what really concerns me about a lot of the language that's going on around plastic right now, calling it a crisis, making it sound like it's the #1 planetary issue facing humanity right now. Okay, so how can we address both? Well, you know, the same mantra that I heard when I was a kid, reduce, reuse, recycle, is still true today. This is really still what we need to do. Now, about 10 or so years ago, an author named Bea Johnson published a book called Zero Waste Home, where she added another line above this, which is refuse. And let me just show you that book. Okay, so this is that book, Zero Waste Home by Bea Johnson. She is a terrific role model if you're looking for someone to emulate, to almost eliminate your environmental footprint from waste that you generate. She literally generates one jar, 1 pint jar of waste per year in her household. She doesn't have a trash can. So I'm not a good role model. I'm an okay role model. I'm going to go through some of the messaging that we're hearing today and talk about some places where I think we should amplify it and some places where I think the main message coming through is getting it wrong. But again, if you're looking for a blueprint for how to live your life with a minimal impact, I highly recommend the book that I was just holding up. And what really concerns me is so much of the discussion today is about recycling and then about replacing. And replacing, as I went over in my last video, is generally going to be bad. Now, it may occasionally reduce impacts a little bit, but for the most part, the materials that we use for the applications they're used for are already optimized economically, which generally means they're also optimized for reducing impacts. Because generally speaking, the cheapest thing to do is the lowest energy thing to do, which is the lowest emissions things to do. Now, there are definitely exceptions to that rule, but my main point is don't get hung up down here. Okay, all this discussion about replacing things, it's about money, right? This is economically what materials you choose for a certain application does make a big difference. So if your main interest in the environmental crisis that we have today is money, then I understand why you would choose to participate mainly in the dialogues around here. But if your primary interest is in reducing environmental footprints, trying to secure a planet that will be fruitful and comfortable for future generations to live in, these are the opportunities up here to reduce your environmental impacts as a consumer. Don't worry about what material it's made from. The difference that will make is minimal compared to the impacts that you can make by changing behaviors in these top categories. So that's what I want to go through today. Okay, let's start with refuse. And single-use materials, this is the category that they fall under. So we're talking about a lot of paper, so food wrappers, containers, coffee cups, newspapers, shipping materials, bottles that are made out of plastic, glass, and aluminum generally, and also a lot of plastic packaging material. We want to just get rid of those as much as we can. So buy from the initial producer as much as you can. So if you can go to a farmer's market and get your food stuff there, that's going to help. But the main thing is just take your own containers. So no matter what kind of shopping you're doing, grocery or otherwise, just bring your own bag. And if you are going out to eat and you think there's a good chance you're going to be bringing home some food, take your own container there. There's no law against taking your leftovers and putting it in your own reusable container to take home with you. Now, the good thing about single-use materials is that they get used once. There are also zero-use materials, and here we're talking primarily about junk mail. In the United States alone, we get over 100 billion pieces of junk mail per year, and that's over 100 million trees worth of paper that almost all of it doesn't even get looked at. It just gets thrown into the recycling, or worse yet, into the trash can. So this has no use. It's manufactured, it's distributed, and then it's either recycled or landfilled, and it serves absolutely no purpose. I'm not even sure why it's legal. If any other entity deposited their garbage into my space, it would be against the law, but for some reason, the mail service is allowed to do it. I'm not 100% sure why. This, you really have to act to get that reduced. And you can do your own internet searches and probably get to the best way to do that just as quickly as me telling you. And then the final one under the category of refuse is giveaways. So whether you're thinking about giving something away or thinking about receiving something that's being given away, just rethink that, because are you really going to use it? And I think it's especially ironic when someone gives away, say, a reusable water bottle at some environmental conference. Well, who's going to use that? I mean, the people attending that conference are generally either people who already have a water bottle that they reuse and they like, or people who don't use reusable water bottles and aren't likely to change their behavior just because they got a free one at some conference. So really what you're doing is this is a single-use or a zero-use material with the environmental footprint of a reusable material. And for reduce, I'm going to start with the policy that Grandpa and Grandma had on the farm. When I was a kid, we used to go out every summer to north central Kansas and help with the wheat harvest. When the wheat was ready to be harvested, everybody needed to pitch in because it needed to be harvested before it went bad. And so it had to happen fast and it had to happen on time. And so my cousins, my aunts, uncles, my parents, we would all go back to the farm around the wheat harvest time and we would all pitch in and try to get that done. And at the end of the day, we'd all get together for dinner and there would be huge trays of food that would be passed around the table. And the rule there was very simple. Take what you'll eat what you take. And that was the rule for the farm table, but I think that's an excellent principle that can be applied to all of our purchasing habits, frankly. So let's start with this one. Have a food plan. About 1/3 of all the food in the world is wasted, and about 43% of that is us. It's at the final mile at the home or at a restaurant. So if you add that up, that's about 4% of greenhouse gases that comes just from food waste, that comes just from us poor planning and ending up not eating everything that we buy, not eating what we take. So I think we can do much better as a society with our food. And as I mentioned in my previous video, if I had to pick one category of material waste that was a crisis, it would absolutely be food. So let's not waste food. Second, use your own water. Okay, so you've heard, have your own reusable water bottle, and I think everybody knows about that, but there are a lot of other opportunities. Think of all the water that gets shipped around in detergents, in soaps, a lot of cleaning products, sports drinks, juices. So buy concentrates and powders whenever you can. They'll last longer and you don't spend the energy to ship a bunch of water around, and they're generally just as efficient as the pre-formulated options that you have. So think about ways that you can use the water out of your tap, which costs almost no energy, almost no money. It will save you money. It will reduce your environmental footprint. And it really doesn't take all that much of a lifestyle change. The last one is change the purchase equation. And I'm going to go over this a little bit more in another slide. But currently the way it works is we look at something and we say, I want that and I can afford to buy it. Therefore, I will purchase it. And I think we need to change that equation to, I will use this material, I will value this material throughout its entire lifespan. And that might be my entire lifespan. And I have the means to purchase it, so therefore I will. And let me tell you a little bit about one example. This is a scientific study. It's not a peer-reviewed paper. It's just published on the internet, and I'll post a link. But this is a study by Patagonia, which if you don't know anything about Patagonia, this tagline for them, Earth is now our only shareholder, that's absolutely true. If you look at their corporate structure, they are for profit, but all of their profits go to environmental causes. So as a corporation, I don't know of any better example than this, or how there could be any better example of this, of how to put the environment first. So they received some feedback from their customers that they don't like the waste generated by these plastic bags that they were shipping their shirts in. And so they evaluated how they could reduce plastic in their supply chain, and they conducted several tests. Now, already I think this is an important point because they took the time to test this. They looked at all the alternatives they could think of, and they determined which had the minimum impact. Now, how many companies will do this, and how many will just say, oh, we heard the voice of our customer doesn't like plastic, so we got rid of plastic and we went to something else, not bothering to check whether that something else would reduce or increase the environmental harm done by their packaging material. So already I think that's exemplary. And what they found was that plastic was the best. Okay, so they tested all the alternatives and they weren't able to find a better material They did take a few actions to reduce impact. They found that they could fold their garments smaller, they used thinner bags, and they educated customers about where to take this plastic if they wanted to recycle it. But the number one thing that I took home from this is this comment at the very end: a damaged product that is unwearable has a far greater environmental cost than manufacturing a polybag. In other words, guys, if you're really concerned about the environment, you're asking the wrong question. You shouldn't be saying, what can you do, corporation, to change your packaging that will maybe make a tiny little difference? Really, you should be asking the question, is this really an appropriate purchase for me to make? Or am I just kind of buying this on a whim? Because that's the environmental impact. It's the shirt. It's not the packaging. It's what's inside the packaging that's important. And by far, the most important property of packaging is that it gets the material to you undamaged. Okay, let's move on. So reuse. Okay, reuse is a verb. Okay. Reusables generally almost always have a higher environmental impact than single-use materials. Reusables are not good for the environment. Reusing things is good for the environment. So don't worry about whether it's a reusable. Think about ways that you can reuse things. So let me just give you a couple examples of reusables. So this is a reusable grocery bag that my wife and I got 26 years ago. We've been using it for a very, very long time. We got 4 of them originally. 2 of them broke and are no longer usable. 2 of them are still usable. We have gotten some additional bags in the meantime, but this one we still do use occasionally. And the point is that it was reused. That's what made it good for the environment. So let me show you another example. This is a plastic bag that is nominally reusable. We get these now because of some health issues that we have in our family. We don't engage with crowds any more than we have to. So we now pick up our groceries. We don't go into the store and grocery shop anymore. And so they come now in these plastic bags. Well, these things are thick plastic because somebody thought it was a good idea not to have disposable plastic bags anymore. So now they don't have disposable plastic bags. They have these reusable plastic bags, which are about 3 times as heavy as the ones that would do the job just as well. And because we don't go into the store, we pick these up, and every time we get 3 times more plastic than we needed. Okay, so I'm sure this policy was well-meaning when it was implemented, but it's really just doing 3 times the harm that it needs to do. I think there are a lot of policies, legislation, activities that are well-meaning, but when you get down to it, they don't actually help, and a lot of times they hurt. Look, forcing people to use reusables is generally not going to work. We have to decide to use reusables on our own. If a consumer decides to go to a reusable material, they're going to make that purchase, and they're going to go with a reusable bag or bottle or whatever else it is that suits their needs. So I would really push back on the idea of legislating reusables, and I would preach more about it and spend more time talking about how important it is, and let the culture shift come. I know there's a lot of impatience about that, but these things do happen over time. Okay, number 2, single use is a decision. So let me just give you another story. So I used to work in a chemistry lab. We had these little cardboard boxes full of vials. And inside there would be these paper dividers that would keep the glass vials from bumping up against each other and breaking as they were shipped. And when we finished with a box full of vials, we would throw the box out. Well, a guy I worked with said, "Hey, can I have that?" Sure. And, he used it as like a starter for some plants. So he liked to grow things at his little farm that he was at. And so he put little plants in it, used the little paper dividers to keep them separate as they were young, and then as they got bigger, he would move them into the soil or bigger containers. But the whole point is that was a single-use box that he found a very clever way to make it reusable. And I think a lot of things are like that. A lot of our storage containers were designed to be single-use containers for lunch meat, for example. When I was a kid, everything we had in the refrigerator was in a butter tub that we'd used all the, well, it was really margarine, but we'd eaten all the margarine, and so we had these plastic tubs left over, and so those were our leftover food containers. So a lot of these single-use things, obviously plastic bags are reusable. They can be liners for trash cans. You can take them on your vacations and put your dirty clothes in them. All of these single-use materials a lot of times can be reused if you just decide to. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, recycle. So recycling is good. I am a fan of recycling, but it should be a last resort option. When you can't refuse, reduce, or reuse a material, the last option for you is recycle, which is better than landfilling or throwing it into the wild. So let's imagine that we're making a ton of aluminum, okay? So a trip around the outside of this circle is production of a ton of aluminum, and the area of the big blue donut is the greenhouse gases that are emitted during the production of that aluminum. So now if you recycle, the good thing is you don't have to push all the way around with virgin production of that aluminum. You get about 70% virgin production and about 30% recycle. That green line is the amount of greenhouse gases emitted to recycle that much aluminum. So it's a huge savings in emissions. So that's aluminum. Here are some numbers. It's over 95% of the emissions are reduced. This is sort of the best example of recycling I know of. This is kind of what we wish all the recycling was like. You reduce the emissions by over 95%. You also reduce energy costs by over 95%. So here are the similar treatments for some other materials. So that's plastic, paper, and glass. Okay, and it's the same thing. The total area you see there is the weighted average emissions to produce a ton of that material. And you can see how much is reduced when you go to green recycling as opposed to blue. Now, I'm not trying to sell you on any material here. This is not a complete life cycle impact analysis. This is just an illustration of what's good and what's bad about recycling, okay? So the first thing, what's good? Well, the green lines are always thinner than the blue lines, okay? So it's always better to recycle from an environmental standpoint than it is to produce virgin material, okay? Secondly, the green lines are always positive. There's something there, okay? It's never free. So anytime we recycle, there is an environmental footprint to that recycling. So if you think, oh, I'll buy this aluminum can, it's recyclable, so it won't have any environmental impact as long as I put it in the recycling after I'm done with it. That's not true. There's still an environmental impact. There's always an environmental impact. It's definitely less when you recycle, but it's not zero. There are issues with all of these, so let's just go through them. Aluminum, yes, it has the greatest savings from recycling, and recycling aluminum, the emissions are very low. They're lower than for plastic or paper, but if you look overall, the weighted average is still by far the highest, so 5.3, so a ton of aluminum still has the most emissions on average. Now this is a little unfair to aluminum cans because they do have a better global recycling rate than 30%. So as you go to one particular application, obviously things will change. But just in general, aluminum still has the highest emissions of these four materials on average. Plastic The good thing about plastic is it starts relatively small. The savings from recycling are pretty good. But what's not captured here is that, yes, there's 9% that's recycled. There's 91% that's not recycled. And something else happens there, and that's not on the graph. So if you burn it, if you landfill it, or if it's reduced into the environment, there are additional environmental impacts from that. And so the bad thing about plastic is it's a double whammy. Only recycling 9% means we're not recycling 91%, and there are additional environmental impacts from that. Paper, the biggest issue with paper is that even when you recycle it, you see 2.52, that's a higher emissions than virgin plastic or virgin glass. So yeah, we recycle a lot of paper. It does reduce emissions quite a bit when we recycle it, but even when you recycle paper, there's still a lot of emissions. Although I will say the good thing about paper is the resource for this is trees, which they do take a while to grow, but they grow a lot faster than the replenishment of bauxite or oil or sand. Now glass, if you just glance at this, you'd say we should make everything out of glass that we can. And in a way that's true if a ton of glass goes as far as a ton of everything else. But let's say you want to make a bottle, let's say a 12-ounce bottle, you need about 10 times as much glass as you do plastic or aluminum. And so if you multiply this by 10, all of a sudden it doesn't look like such a great advantage anymore. The other thing is, on an absolute scale, the emissions savings is not all that great, and the energy savings is also not all that great. So from an economic standpoint, recycling of glass is often not all that great. And you'll even see cullet, which is glass to be recycled, will have a negative value. So all of these materials have their issues. The number one thing I wanted to point out in this is it's always better from an environmental standpoint to recycle. It's never free. It never means zero impact. There's always some impact, even from recycling. Okay, so now replace. I'm going to urge you not to replace things. In general, keep what you have, use it till it breaks, fix it if you can. Okay, and so I'm going to start with refuse to panic. So let's go back to that producer from that Science Versus episode where they talked about microplastics in brain article that was not correct. She also mentioned how she was finding a lot of bullshit in the scientific literature around plastic, and she brought up one particular example.
There's also all that stuff about how much of the chemicals in black plastic cooking utensils were like leaking into our food. Yeah, that made a big splash. People were throwing out their spatulas, but turns out that those researchers also screwed up their math. And in fact, the chemicals that are leaching out of the utensils are way lower than what first got reported.
Right. So this was an example, and she says people were throwing out their spatulas based on bad information. Well, they weren't just throwing out their old spatulas, they were buying new spatulas, right? So you're talking about a whole new set of environmental impacts. And I've been reading all kinds of examples where people are worried about microplastics or plastics in general, and they're replacing everything that's plastic in their kitchen, buying all this new stuff. And that's just panic-driven responses that create additional waste because you're throwing away plastic, and create additional environmental impacts by the manufacturing needed for all the stuff that you bought to replace the old stuff that was in your kitchen. So look, if you have a glass cutting board, keep using it. If you have a plastic cutting board, keep using it. If you have a wooden cutting board, keep using it. Look, there's no reason to panic and run out and replace all this stuff. And as a scientist, I know there have been some really scary publications, and I really don't blame you if you did overreact. And if you did replace all your plastic stuff with new stuff, just keep your new stuff, okay? Don't run out and replace all the time. And I just apologize to you as a scientist. This should not happen. The function of the scientific literature should be more along the lines of what I'm doing right now, telling you not to panic, telling you what the true situation is, not going off on tangents and telling you a bunch of information that's not supported by the data. So look, as a scientist, I apologize. If you panicked, if you overreacted, I don't blame you. And if you're a scientist, if you're an editor, if you're a reviewer watching this, do better. And if you're a scientist who is doing better, speak up. I mean, this should not happen. And that's why I started making all these videos, because it's bullshit. It's bullshit. There shouldn't be bullshit in the science. Reject hype. There's a lot of hype about, we can't use plastic bags because this and this and this. And so there's all these policies moving towards paper or whatever. Look, it's nonsense, okay? You don't need to replace plastic bags. They're already the lowest impact choice. As a consumer, bring your own bags. If you run a grocery store, if you run any sort of store, don't make a big shift into some other kind of bag. It's not going to help. And then resist sensationalism. And again, unfortunately, microplastics is the number one source of sensationalist misinformation that's available to the public right now. While we're in the category of replace, I want to talk a little bit about extended producer responsibility. The idea is that there's some environmental impact during the production of that good. The consumer buys it, and then there's an additional societal burden that results from the use and disposal of that material. And that is not reflected in the price, and it should be. And the idea behind extended producer responsibility is that should be included in the price so that environmental impact, not just to make the material, but also to use and dispose of the material, should be the responsibility of the producer and should be reflected in the price. Now, I actually agree with the fundamental principle behind this. I don't like the name of it, and there are some other things that I would change. So this goes to what's called externalities. There are side effects and consequences of commercial activities that affect other parties without that being reflected in the cost of the goods or services involved. This is what this is really about. It's been around since the 1890s. It hasn't been addressed until the 1990s, which is when these EPR rules first came on the books. I think externalities should be included in sale prices, and I do think EPR is a good idea as long as it is applied equally across all of the materials and all of the options within an application, and as long as the evaluation, the adder, is based on some sort of measure of societal impact that's applied equally across all of the options. This is a concept that I think is critically important. This concept of externalities that has not been taken into account in our economic price structures for a century really needs to be. Now, what I would do, number one, I would not call it an extended producer responsibility, because that takes the responsibility away from the consumer. It's the consumer. Look, once I've bought something, it's my responsibility, okay? So I don't want anyone telling me that this is still the responsibility of whoever made this product, that end of life and the use of that, the impact of that is someone else's problem. I think that's a bad message to send. So it's semantics, because the price is going to go up regardless of who you assign responsibility to. I would call it something like a full impact tax. And ideally, I would impose this impact tax at every stage along the production and use and end of life scenario of every material. And I know this may look like this is going to be a lot of bureaucracy, and it probably is. But for capitalist society to make a change like this it's going to involve bureaucracy, because keep in mind, it's always weird to me to hear people being angry with corporations. Look, the role of corporations in a capitalist economy is to make as much profit as they can. That's their role. And they need to do it within the rules and regulations set by the government and by society. And so if we're angry with the way that corporations are behaving, ask yourself, are they maximizing profit? Because if they are, they're playing their role. And if they are maximizing profit and they're still behaving in a way that is unsavory for us, then that's the responsibility of our government to change that. We need to regulate. We need to incorporate laws and regulations that make sure that the behavior of corporations do no harm, and that secure a comfortable planet for future generations to live on. And I think that's critically important. We need to press our legislators and our regulators to incorporate more of this kind of thing, these kinds of taxes. There should be laws against doing things that are going to poison the environment, and then there should be charges in the form of taxes or fees for any sorts of impacts. And then in this imaginary world where I'm master of the universe, this would replace or incorporate all the other taxes that we currently have, like the gas tax, pollution taxes, the EPRs that we currently have. All of that would roll up into one full impact tax, which would be applied at every price point along the value chain. So I don't know whether or not you've made up your mind about whether I am in fact a pro-plastic justice warrior, but if I were to get on board with some of these things that you see here, it would make me a lot happier to just remove one word from that. I think it doesn't make any sense to try to address plastic waste or plastic pollution in a vacuum, because you can trick yourself into thinking you're making a positive change because you're reducing the impacts of plastic, when overall the change is in the wrong direction. And that's what concerns me the most about some of these initiatives. Okay, so finally, just some closing remarks. A lot of people are looking for a technological solution to this. It's like, well, why don't you just make me something that acts like plastic, but it doesn't have an environmental footprint. It doesn't have any harm to the environment at all. And the problem is you can't. And it hurts me to say that, because for a long time I was that guy that you come to and say, make me this, make me this. And I wish there was a technological solution to the problem, but this is not like energy, where there are technological ways to really greatly reduce impacts compared to fossil fuel burning, wind, solar, nuclear. But you can't make a bag out of the wind, right? You can't make a bottle out of sunshine. Things are made out of stuff, and anything that we make is going to have a negative environmental footprint. There's just no way around it, okay? So if you want to make a positive change here, you really have to do it yourself. As a consumer, the best way to make a change is to just simply use less stuff and use the stuff that we use more efficiently. Other people might say this is a political or an economic problem. I think we have the political and economic tools available to our disposal that we could address this. We just don't have the will. We don't have the societal will. And so I think really the problem lies within philosophy, okay? And I've been a professional scientist for many years. I'm an amateur philosopher, and I'm not much of an influencer. So I can't really do that very well. But if you're looking for a foundational principle on which to base that philosophical idea, I'm going to take you back to the farmhouse where Grandma had another rule. And, we all got dirty during harvest time at the farm, whether we were injecting grease into the combines or driving the combine out without any cab and feeling the wheat dust blowing onto the backs of our necks, or we were driving the unair conditioned truck with the wheat in it to and from town where it went into the elevator. We all came home dirty, and we were lucky enough by the time I was going to help harvest, there was running water in the farmhouse, and there was a bathtub. And so I'd wait in line with my brothers and sisters and my cousins, and then mom and dad and aunts and uncles, and then finally grandpa and grandma would each have our turn in the bath. And there was only one rule for that, and that was you leave the bathtub cleaner than you found it. Thanks for watching. There's more to come.